Welcome to Doing Time with Joe. I'm your host, Joe Baker, back again with another episode, y'all. In this episode, I'm going to be talking about dealing with your anxieties in the moment, right? Embracing the anxiety attack that you may have and working your way through it. I experienced that the other night during the college class that I take from Western Kentucky. We were talking about the death penalty. You know, this class here is about social ethics, and one of the topics of discussion is the death penalty. We had to read some literature about it, and then we have a discussion about it uh, during the class. And it was a very, very trying night for me during class, and I want to share with you what that was like for me. So that's what this episode is going to be about, and I hope that it helps someone because it was tough, y'all. But I'm going to let that be known uh, openly, honestly, transparently. I'm going to let you know exactly what I was going through, and I hope that it helps you or somebody that you know if it's not something that you have to live with. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the show. Yeah, the other night during class, right? The topic of discussion was, the death penalty. That was our lesson that we had to read. We read this literature. All the students had to read the literature about the death penalty and all the different aspects of it, the retributive side of it, the restorative side, and we had various different philosophers making the case for and against the death penalty. So we had to have a discussion about that, and when it came time to discuss, I raised my hand and I was uh, willing to speak out and share my experience with that because, as some of you may know, I faced the death penalty. I was on trial for my life for the crimes that I committed. And I have to be honest and admit that when I was reading the literature, I had to put it down several times. It was just difficult for me to read because it was bringing back a lot of those old memories that I had. What it was like to sit at a table and hear the DA and my lawyer go back and forth trying to determine after the guilt and innocence phase. I'd already been found guilty. I'm talking about during the penalty phase. Uh, when you go to trial for your life, there are two phases. Like I said, one is the guilt and innocence phase. I had already gone through that and had been found guilty by the jury, and that led to the penalty phase, where that same jury would decide if I would be put to death or not. And the process for that is that the jury has to come to a unanimous conclusion to put me to death. If one person says no, they didn't agree with the death penalty in this particular case, I would be spared. My life would be spared. And in my situation, it was an 8-4 vote. 8 people voted for the death penalty. 4 people voted against it. So I was sentenced to a life sentence with parole because that's the sentence that was on the table in the event that I didn't get the death penalty. So as I was reading my lesson uh, to prepare for class, like I said, I had to put the literature down several times because my mind kept flashing back to listening to my lawyer and the DA discuss whether or not I deserve, on the DA side, whether he's saying that I deserve to die, my lawyer saying that I deserve to live. And it was hard for me because during that process of getting prepared for the trial, I was I had to be interviewed for what they call a pre-sentencing report. And that pre-sentencing report was prepared by a firm out of California. that um, when they went over all of the information about my life, talked to all of my family and friends, people that knew me, they learned something about my life that I didn't even know, and that was that my mother uh, had been murdered by someone that I had grown up looking up to. Um, the circumstances of that are tricky. I wrote about that in my book, but I'm going to go ahead and tell you. Um, my mother was murdered by a guy that thought she had stolen from him. This guy was a pimp, but he was a family friend, but he had prostitutes, you know, in another city. But he was from Springfield, Tennessee. So anyway, my auntie was friends with him, you know. I think they knew each other growing up, whatever. But anyway, he had hidden some drugs at her house. With her consent, he had left them there anyway. And they came up missing. And for whatever reason, I don't know what the reason was, as the story came to me, he thought that my mother had something to do with his drugs coming up missing. And at the time, my mother was in the hospital when this stuff come up missing. Well, when he was looking for her, she happens to be in the hospital for female issues. So he went to the hospital with some woman that we still don't know who it was, and attempted to inject her with heroin to loosen her up to get her to talk, because she was telling him that she had no idea what he was talking about, but he thought she was lying. So during the process of this taking place, a nurse walks in, they get spooked, so they hid the drugs in her bag, her overnight bag, which had her tampons in it. And the nurses were coming in to change her tampon because, like I say, my mom was in the hospital for female issues. And when they changed her tampon, unknowingly, they, uh, because the tampon had heroin hidden in it some kind of way, the heroin went into my mother's system and it killed her. And I didn't know anything about that. I had been told at the age of 7, when my mother died, that she had died from cancer, breast cancer. And that's what I grew up thinking. But regardless of the reason my mother died, I suffered uh, a shutdown. When my mother died, I stopped talking for 3 months. They had to take me out of school and all of that kind of stuff. And eventually I started talking again. But it was so traumatic for me that over the course of my entire life, uh, I was told, after I found out about how my mother really died, I was told by my grandmother on my father's side, because that's who I called and asked, why didn't y'all tell me? Um, they said it just never seemed to be the right time. And my other grandmother that I called, my mother's mother, said the same thing almost. It was like everybody in the entire family knew why my mother had died, how my mother had died, but decided the best thing for me was to not know, because they didn't think I could handle it. So I found this out in preparation for my own trial, my own murder trial. And it had the most profound effect on me. Um, it made me understand what my victims had to have felt about me, and that they wanted me to die because I wanted him to die. And what I learned in wanting him to die is that I had to forgive him. Because if I didn't forgive him, then in my mind, my victims would never come to the time or place or point in their lives to forgive me. So, what I ended up doing was I forgave him. Not out of a selfish reason of wanting my victims to forgive me, but because, as my grandmother put it was the right thing to do. And I'm a believer, and being a believer, I have to accept that uh, it, God doesn't say what. This is hard, y'all. God doesn't say if it's this particular crime or that particular crime, you don't have to worry about forgiving. He said forgive or you're not going to be forgiven. And that pushed me, moved the needle, let's say, for me to where I had to forgive him. And it was then that I started to really understand how my victims must have felt. But while I'm sitting there in the courtroom and they're going back and forth, I was afraid beyond anything that I can describe. I had never experienced anything like that. And I was just dumbfounded as to how these two people, the defense, my lawyer, and the prosecution, were talking about me in a way that it was like I was just a name on paper to the DA, but I was a human being to my lawyer. He's trying to make the jury see me as a human being. The DA's trying to get the jury to see me as somebody that deserves to die. And it was just hard for me to sit there and listen to. And part of me shut down. It triggered the same type of responses that I felt when I learned of my mother's death. And the other night in class, when I was sharing this with everybody in the class, at the time, I didn't think anybody realized what I was going through. But I found out the other day when I was talking about this to one of my friends, Michael. He realized something was happening because while I was sharing the story, my voice was getting lower and lower. I was slouching in the chair, and I don't do that. When I talk, I sit up and I look at the room while I'm talking to the other students and the professor. I didn't engage them this time with my eyes. My voice was getting lower and lower, and Michael, he said, talk up, speak up. He knew something was happening, he just didn't know what. He said it looked to him as if I felt like I was like trapped or something, right? He knew that just by looking at me. He didn't realize I was having an anxiety attack. Nobody did, but I did. I knew exactly what was happening. And this time, I had made a conscious decision in the moment of this anxiety attack not to shut down. I kept telling myself, this is not real. It's okay to feel bad about what you did, but you're not scum. Because that's what I started thinking in my mind about what the students must have been thinking about me. They had never shown me anything but the utmost respect. But while I was telling that story and looking down at the ground, my mind was telling me that they're judging me. They see me as a monster. And I was telling myself while I was talking to the class, looking down at the ground, that it's not true. You're not a monster. You made a bad, horrendous decision, but you're not a monster. And trying to convince myself with my quiet voice and continue to talk with my active voice at the same time, if that makes any sense to you, I didn't realize that my tone of voice was getting lower and lower, and Michael pulled me back by saying, speak up, I can't hear you, speak up. That pulled me out. But I still felt the sweatiness of my palms. My heart felt like it was going to jump out of my chest. And parts of my story I left out. So throughout the entire 2 hours of talking, I would ask for the floor to speak again and again and again, adding parts of the story that I had left out, commenting about this, commenting about that, because I was fighting through that response that I would normally take when I suffer an anxiety attack, which is to shut down. I was pushing through that. I did not want to give in to that. I don't want to live my life on the sideline. And that's what you do when you suffer an anxiety attack. you find yourself not participating in life because you're afraid. And that night in class, I was so afraid that they might see me different, that I almost shut down, but I refused to do it. And it was extremely difficult to push through that all alone by myself. I didn't have the words to say to them, y'all, I'm having an attack right now. I didn't know how to say it. I did not know how to verbalize that. But at the end of the class, I was still feeling anxious. And when we got up to leave, normally the door would be unlocked and we'd go in the hallway and we'd get patted down by the officers as we left back and walked back to our units. But this particular night, y'all, the doors were locked. We couldn't get out. And I freaked out. I needed some air. I needed to get out of there. So the class was huddled in the area that we sit in talking back and forth to each other. And I was in the distance. I couldn't do it, you know. And one of the students that I'm real cool with, he was joking or whatever. And then I walked back over, I fist bumped him and all this and that, you know. And that helped me to re-engage, to push off that fear that I was feeling. That fear that I was feeling was telling me to separate yourself. That helped me. Just being able to re-engage. And then I was standing there. I went back to where I was at. I was standing there. I was talking to a friend of mine, and I didn't even tell him what I was experiencing. Then the officer came in, let us out, and once we got out that back door, I took a deep breath, and I was okay. But I wanted to share this story with you because I do believe that a lot of people out there experience their anxiety attacks all alone. And I want to tell you that it's okay in the midst of the anxiety attack to tell somebody, say something, so they'll know how to help you. See, in here it's hard to ask for help because most of us, we don't even understand what's going on with ourselves. And people in here weaponize anything that they can against you. So you become reluctant to even ask anybody in here for help. But I was surrounded by a lot of people that I trusted, that make me feel comfortable. Our class is like a family unit, as much as it can be. Within boundaries, all of these rules that we have to play by. But during the course of the class, we develop these bonds of I can trust you, and we share things with each other in that class that don't cross the line of the rules that are set down that we have to be governed by, but in our own way, it lets each one of us know that I can feel safe in here. I can be open with my thoughts when it comes to the academic stuff that we're talking about. I don't have to pretend in here. But that night, I couldn't do it. I wish I would have, but I couldn't. At the end of the day, I thought that it would be important for me to share this because you don't have to go through these things alone. And this is more so for people on the streets than the people in here. We have to go through things in a different way in here. It's unfair, but it's real. But if you're out there, don't suffer through this alone. I know how hard it is dealing with anxiety attacks on your own. Ask somebody for help. Let people know that you suffer anxiety attacks. Find that courage And I think that will help you along. Just taking that step. Just let people know that you suffer anxiety attacks, and it'll go a long way in helping you and helping them to understand you a little bit more. That's why I wanted to do this. You don't have to suffer this type of thing alone. And I wanted you to know that, from me to you. Like I've said, since I started doing my shows, I'm an open book. If I experience something, I'm not going to hide it. I'm going to share it. Sometimes it's going to hurt, you know what I'm saying? But hurting in this situation is healing. I may cry, but that's okay too. That's what they have napkins for. All righty, y'all. This has been another episode of Doing Time with Joe. I'm your host, Joe Baker. And I say peace, y'all.